you hear me okay? I know it looks like I'm double mic'd, and I am double mic'd, so this is a very serious session because of that. We are actually also live streamed as well, so just fair warning to all of the folks in the room, if you object to being recorded, hopefully you won't leave. Because I think this conversation is actually super important, and I'm actually happy it's a smaller group because I think we can have some more intimate style conversations as opposed to the panel talking at you. Hopefully we can be more iterative. So the session today is really how we rethink the notion of vulnerability and resilience. And before I start, because we have so few people in the room, maybe we'll just take a quick 30 seconds to introduce yourself, just your agency and why you in particular care or are about this topic or why you're here. So, and just for a record, and speakers as well, only 2 mics can be on at the same time. So when we're done talking, we just have to turn it off. Okay? Sure. But I'll go around this way and we'll come back to us.
Yeah, my name's Sarneet. I'm with Adelphi, and in terms of why this topic is important to me, I grew up in like East Asia, so I think it's like sort of in the region of where, you know, a lot of climate vulnerabilities happen. So I think it's interesting to hear about people's different perspectives on the topic. Thank you.
So I'm Antonia. I'm a researcher with Potsdam University. We are at the moment working with water extremes and of course flash floods and those things, and therefore we're thinking kind of the vulnerability of groups that are prone to those areas.
Kia ora, I'm Constance Kelly and I'm with the New Zealand Embassy here in Berlin, so I'm local and come to this conference every year. I'm particularly interested in this because obviously island states, our neighbourhood, we are an island state. Great to have a friend from the Forum Secretariat here today, and it's a really big part of New Zealand's development policy, but also our own security policy about how we support the countries in our neighbourhood. So really keen to hear what the view is from Europe, from others in this room, around how we tackle some of these challenges together. So great to be here.
Okay. Hello, Naoyuki from the United Nations University in Japan. I'm here because we are running one project funded by Ministry of Foreign Affairs Japan about climate security in the Asia-Pacific region, and we are looking into the mobility and displacement issue, especially in the small island states in the Pacific. So yeah, that brought me to here and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
My name is Walter. I'm presently here as a fellow at the Bosch Academy, but usually I'm doing work for the Platform on Disaster Displacement, which is a successor to the Nansen Initiative. And we have been working a lot in the Pacific, but also in the other parts of the world. I'm particularly interested in the cultural aspects of resilience, vulnerability.
Hi, my name is Emma Whitaker, and I'm a senior advisor also at Adelphi, and I'm here because I think island nations have obviously been at the forefront of the conversation around climate security, so I think there's a lot we can continue learning, and I'm excited for the exchange. And also recently, Adelphi conducted a climate security risk assessment in Sri Lanka, so if useful, happy to contribute some perspectives from that as well. Thanks.
Yeah, my name is Lukas Rüttinger. I'm also senior advisor at Adelphi. And yeah, I think at Adelphi we've been trying to work more on the Pacific context, and I think that's what I'm particularly interested in. I think there's still this disconnect where the Pacific is very vocal on the global stage in terms of climate security, but it's not really reflected in terms of analysis and specific climate security action. So yeah, that's something that we've started working. I'm also just back from Papua New Guinea and also happy to contribute some insights from there.
Great, thank you. That is wonderful. And it sounds like there's a lot of experts in the room. So again, this is more of an iterative dialogue. I'm going to introduce my actually, I'm going to let my panelists in. Oh, sorry. You were in my blind spot. Please come up and introduce.
This is Nick from the Center for Humanitarian Program. Right. So I mainly support HD's projects in Myanmar and also in the Bay of Bengal. So Sri Lanka would be a very relevant context. So would definitely love to learn more about how the climate narrative and also resilience work is being carried out in the Pacific or maybe in the Caribbean too. Thank you.
Perfect. And thank you for the folks that are live streaming or will watch this later. A very warm welcome to you as well. We can't see you, but we appreciate your presence online. Okay, so this session, we have quite a bit of time here. And so again, this is, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of experts, not only on our expert panelists, but obviously in the room. So this is an opportunity to break down some of those silos that we were talking about earlier and really kind of get into the nitty-gritty. The origin story for this session was really to rethink how vulnerability I think historically has been misconstrued as coming from a bad place, right? All vulnerability is bad, and inherently that means that all resilience is good. And I don't think that those things are necessarily on the same ends of a spectrum. And I think that that's very dynamic and it shifts. And so our expert panelists are here to talk about sort of rethinking vulnerability as well as resilience. And as I mentioned earlier, I think you do need some vulnerability in order to develop that resilience, because it's really the catalyst. There was some work that we were doing in South America, and we were looking at communities in sort of disaster-prone areas in earthquakes, and looking to see how digital technologies could obviously help moving communities really fast. And what we found was that communities who had historically had been displaced, had been moved already, were actually much more mobile and actually much more resilient compared to the communities who hadn't experienced earthquakes and had historically been more resilient, right? And so I think that tension between vulnerability and resilience, again, is something that we hope to draw out with our speakers. I'm going to turn it over to them to introduce themselves, because you can hear less about me talking, and then I'm going to ask them some very tough questions, and also give you the opportunity to ask them some tough questions. So maybe I'll start with Paula, and then go over to you, Jamie.
Oh, sorry. So yes, I'm Paul Junot. I'm a legal advisor and a legal environmental law specialist and mediator for UNEP in Haiti.
Yeah, kia ora. My name's Jamie, and I'm the Climate Security Advisor through the CSM, second to the Pacific Islands Forum. So the Pacific Islands Forum represents the 18 member states in the Pacific.
Great. Okay, so we're gonna, oops, can you turn that off? Thank you. Okay, sorry. Look at this. Collaboration. I'm going to give you both an opportunity to perhaps open with some framing remarks. And Jamie, I think if you could also introduce a little bit more about the PRF in particular, I think that would be super helpful. And then I'm going to dive into some more specific questions. So do you have a preference on who wants to give some maybe framing remarks? Ladies first. Okay. What a gentleman. Questions. Okay, Paula, how can legal and policy frameworks in island nations be adapted to better reflect and protect territorial and cultural ties that underpin community resilience without being overly prescriptive and tokenistic? There's your second question, which I can ask you now, or how would you? Okay, I'll just ask the whole gist of the questions, and then you can frame it however you want to. The second question is really, what approaches have you seen from your perspective that are most effective in bridging that gap between formal policy and locally grounded resilient strategies, especially in the context of limited trust or institutional fragility? So obviously very hard questions to answer in a short amount of time, but again, I think we're primed to have that conversation now. Thanks.
Thank you. First, I'm very happy to be here today with all of you. It's a small group, but we have people also online, so I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for this interesting discussion. Okay, so the question, I'm an environmental law specialist, and the question has the word legal and policy frameworks, also vulnerability. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. Antonio Guterres was saying in 2021 that making peace with nature is the defining task of the coming decades. Humanity must change its relationship with nature because our current model, based on domination, extraction, and separation, has led to climate instability, biodiversity collapse, and social inequality. You probably are all well aware of this advisory opinion rendered by the International Court of Justice this last July regarding the obligations of states in respect to climate change. This landmark case follows years of lobbying by small island states. The questions asked to the court by the UN General Assembly were the following. What are the obligations of states under international law to ensure the protection of the climate system? What are the legal consequences under these obligations? The court confirms that states have the obligations to protect the climate system and that the environment from greenhouse gas emissions. A breach by a state of this obligation constitutes an internationally wrongful act entailing the responsibility of that state. Legal obligations include cessation of the wrongful action, full reparation of the injured state in the form of restitution, compensation, satisfaction. According to this advisory decision of the International Court of Justice, climate finance for small island nations then becomes a legal right. But with climate finance, all kinds of paradigms are imposed on vulnerable island nations. International climate law and finance are built on anthropocentric foundations, such as the value of ecosystemic services, where coral reefs, mangroves, and forests are treated as services rather than being harmed by extractive systems. This approach is also utilitarian, where ecosystems have value insofar as they save human needs, such as fisheries and flood protections. It is this anthropocentric and narrow utilitarian view of nature that created this environmental and climate crisis in the first place. So relying on this approach for transformation will not lead us very far. This is where small island states have a lot to teach to the rest of the world, some part of the world anyway. The cultures and histories of small island states are more ecocentric because they prioritize the intrinsic value of nature, viewing humans as part of larger ecological web rather than its pastor. In Polynesian cultures, the ocean is a sacred pathway, not an obstacle. In the Caribbean, mangroves and coral reefs are providers and protectors. In 2025, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights took a historic step by recognizing nature as a subject of law in its advisory opinion on climate emergency at the request of Colombia and Chile. This opinion marks a break with the dominant anthropocentric approach. It paves the way for legal eco-spirituality, where the earth is recognized as a living entity deserving of respect. Both landmark decisions are empowering for small island states who have been powerful moral voices in international climate negotiations. So I would answer your question by saying that incorporating the rights of nature in the Constitution or in the national legal frameworks of the small island nations is definitely a powerful step. Ecuador has done so, Colombia, it's in its legal framework, and something with New Zealand, recognizing the river as a legal person. So this is definitely a first step. Along with cultural, spiritual, and ecological traditions that are rooted in their ancestral ties to the land. I've read that Vanuatu and allied states across the Pacific are drafting a UN resolution that will hold states and big polluters accountable to their climate actions based on this International Court of Justice decision. So this will certainly put a lot of pressure on international climate diplomacy. And the second question I'll answer very quickly. I'm sure Jamie will dive into this more than I will. At the local level, it appears that it's really important to integrate the heritage values, practices, and traditional knowledge of communities in the resilience and adaptive actions and programming. It is crucial to be really transformative climate action, including communal and adaptive land relationships, because we don't own the land, we don't own the ocean. We have to take a different paradigm on these legal issues.
Thank you. I have a million questions, and it's a very rare opportunity that you get to ask somebody who's a legal scholar some questions. So this is, a really great opportunity for you all to be able to phone a lawyer friend to ask any questions. But before we do that, Jamie, I have a couple of questions for you. I think the first one is really, and we started talking about this earlier, how is climate change vulnerability shaped vulnerability in the Pacific Islands, and how can these insights be leveraged by this community, by other policymakers who may be listening in? Secondly, if you could please raise up how Pacific Island nations are often leading in integrating cultural identity and community, which is a comment that one of our guests wanted to know a little bit more about, and community knowledge into resilient strategies. And so are there lessons that you can share with us from the Pacific that are most relevant for other island nations, recognizing that all island nations are inherently very unique, but still welcome your comments on that. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me here. And yeah, like you said, the Pacific is extraordinarily diverse linguistically, as well as sort of, we got matriarchal, we have patriarchal societies, we have, low-lying atoll states, and we have the larger sort of volcanic states as well. But I think the concept of vulnerability is really interesting, and it's used in two different ways at two different levels, and the understanding of vulnerability at our community level is very different to the vulnerability which Pacific Island leaders and other SIDS use in international platforms. The vulnerability in that context from the Pacific's perspective is used to hold those high-emitting states accountable, to seek justice, and then in the end seek finance as a bottom line. But they also have kind of, along with other SIDS, started to challenge the metrics which are used, at least in the global sense, to define vulnerability. And this is through the multidimensional vulnerability index, which argues that small island developing states have a number of structural inequalities which are not measured solely based on economic factors. They are also more exposed to climate shocks and things like that. And they have a number of other dependencies and structural issues which are really challenging. And I guess, so that's sort of how it's understood, more global level, perhaps what the Pacific would call a more Western lens of what vulnerability is. Through a Pacific lens, it's really interesting, but actually the word vulnerability doesn't actually have a translation into a lot of Pacific languages. Resilience does, which is really interesting. And I think that's important to understand how, vulnerability and resilience are interconnected. And I mean, a lot of the small island states that we have in the Pacific are, by nature, they're isolated. They don't have much agricultural land. They're pretty harsh environments anyway. And so, in that sense, when Pacific people who were always very mobile settled these islands, it required that they merge their worldview with the environment. And so, what we get out of that is we have a whole lot of social and cultural structures around mediating life in an environment where resources are scarce, et cetera, et cetera. And so you got communal food sharing. We used to see migration between islands and food stress. We've got traditional and cultural governance mechanisms around disputes and trying to keep that social cohesion in there as well. And so I think that's really important because the concepts of vulnerability and resilience are really interconnected in that view. And I think what we still see in the Pacific today is we still see that the state doesn't really extend far past the centres. In many of those rural areas, those informal governance systems still are the ones with legitimacy. And so their cultural practices, which they've had they've had to develop, which is their resilience, are still there, but they've been challenged by a number of structural issues like colonization, aid dependency, and these types of things. So those communities can see vulnerability through those type of structural challenges. And then you layer climate over top, and it's an added pressure on those kind of mechanisms. And I think the top-down, Pacific's the most aid-dependent region in the world, and aid projects are less effective than anywhere else. And a lot of times it's said that it's the state capacity which limits that. So those state institutions don't have the resources to be able to deliver to the communities. But I think there's another aspect in that there's a failure to understand the worldview of those local communities when we're designing, either climate adaptation or peace building or whatever it might be. So the Pacific Resilience Facility has been referenced a couple of times, and Germany's put some money into that island as well. So it's really good. And I guess the rationale behind the Pacific Resilience Facility is an acknowledgement of the fact that in many cases top-down adaptation's or top-down donor support's not always working, and we need another facility to enable actually those communities to identify their risks and be able to access immediate funds. And so the PRF is designed as a mechanism that can inject funding and resources into local communities based on their own interpretation of what their risks to vulnerability and resilience may be.
Thank you. I obviously also have a million follow-up questions for you because I think you both just gave a masterclass in how we look at vulnerability and resilience in these very varied landscapes, but really also how we can use the legal system, which in the U.S. there's some issues going on with how our courts are operating, but really in our favor here to protect the environment. And maybe I'll just start with a quick question for you, Paule, in terms of you mentioned that nature of services, as providing services, right, is a narrow and utilitarian, which I thought was interesting. Because in the conservation, certainly in some of the water world, the concept of payment for economic services is actually seen as a justification to increase and facilitate conservation. And so it kind of seems to me that those two things might be inherently incompatible. But I was just wondering if you could draw that comment out a little bit in terms of when is nature represented from a non-utilitarian perspective, and how can we use it to protect nature, essentially?
Yeah, that's a difficult question because I think that like nature as not an utility, but man as part of nature is more of like a conscience type of perspective. So it's more like a spiritual conscience type of perspective. Of course, when you work with nature, when you want to finance some conservation activities, you need some numbers. So you need some quantification somewhere. What I was advocating against, because that wasn't I think the native populations of or indigenous populations of small island states, or even in Canada, they were not quantifying what the river is worth. And how can you negotiate a river? A river is a being, as you are a being. We're all part of a system. So that's, I think the perspective that small island nations, but also Native Americans and also other, of course, countries can teach our world, which is seeing nature as a utility. Another thing is that often we negotiate and we forget that nature has needs. Ecosystems are very complex beings that have needs of their own, and they are not represented at the table. And that's what the rights of nature actually is doing. And in IT, we're doing it with a transformative environmental type of mediation, where there's this mediation. Okay, so we have this problem related to the environment. You're fishing, and where I was fishing, no, it's okay. What agreement can we agree? Well, you'll do it Monday, I'll do it Tuesday. This is type of agreement that doesn't take into account that the ecosystems has its own voice and its own needs. So what we're trying to do is to come back with the view, the philosophy that the Haitians had before colonization, and before we imposed upon them property rights and other values that were not their values at the first. So, and how can we put nature back in the discussions, give nature a voice. So in this particular initiative, we have young people who are trained to be the voice of nature in their community. So we have a problem, we'll fix it, but someone has to be the voice of nature to make sure that the solution that we devise will take into account the complexity and the resilience of the ecosystems. That's where resilience come in, and that's where historic resilience of the island states come in.
Okay, I'm going to ask Jamie one question, and then I want you all to be thinking of questions, because I'm going to quickly turn it over to you, and then I'm not talking anymore, so good luck. Okay, Jamie, I really thought the comment that you made about vulnerability not having a direct translation, but resilience having one, was so fascinating, and I was like immediately scribbling that down. In terms of what the PRF is doing, and we talked about the diversity of matrilineal and versus patrilineal societies. How are you reconciling the diversity of the island nations, but still inherently protecting that resilience?
Yeah, I guess it's going to be a challenge. In the Pacific, we don't have like a lot of outward. We're a relatively peaceful region. We don't have outward conflict, but we do have other structural things inside our societies. Gender-based violence is the highest in the Pacific, for example. So I think that there are these challenges that need to be addressed when we're working at that community level, and there's a long way to go in terms of trying to make that change. And I think it's the same with communities understanding climate change. They've done a lot of surveys and things about what sources of information people trust. And where do they get their information from? Most people in the Pacific get their information from mobile devices and the internet now. Some of it comes through traditional authorities, some of it comes through the church, some of it comes through the state. But when they ask the question of what sources of information do you trust the most, it's always the church. It's always informal, customary leadership, even though they don't always get a majority of the information from it. So I think there's a long way to go in terms of and there's some really good work going on in the Pacific. There's like Pacific Conference of Churches who are really proactive in climate change and have starting to mainstream climate change into the work they do through the church. And I think there's some way to go for us in terms of gender-based violence and the equality of women and the role of youth inside our societies in the Pacific. And I hope that when those when our communities as well as our civil society organisations are able to access that finance directly from the PRF, we hope that they can use that money to try and make some changes. And the civil society group, we've got really strong women's peacebuilding groups in the Pacific who stand to benefit from the access to this funding, and it'll hopefully enable them to do more work in those communities where it's really needed. And there's definitely a lot of work that we need to do, and there's still, I think it's the reason something like the PRF is you don't see it replicated is because there are challenges in governance around putting money into the PRF. How do we make sure that the governance is adequate and able to enable us to be sure about where those funds are going and that they're being used in the way that they should be? I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
Yes, do you mind? Thanks. Okay, I promised I was going to shut up, and now I am going to shut up. So I'm looking at you all. You guys, you have two fantastic experts. Obviously, you all are experts too, but I invite you all to make any observations or have, ask some questions. So the floor is open to you all. Yay. Thank you, Emma.
Yeah, hopefully it's more coherent than the rambling in my head right now, but thank you so much, so interesting, and I could ask all the questions to take up the whole time. I guess just a reflection on the concept of vulnerability and resilience as like potentially a positive is super interesting, and I'm struggling to understand vulnerability potentially as a positive, so it's interesting to hear the lack of sort of resonance in different languages in the Pacific, and so would invite any further thought on that as well. But I guess my question would be, without going into like a utopian vision of solutions, what would be a really sort of concrete or short-term or medium-term sort of what would positive action look like? What would it mean to say, okay, we've achieved a certain level of climate security, and demonstrating, okay, we're continuing on this positive action. Obviously, there's been a whole lot, but I guess more speaking personally from both of your perspectives and your work, and hopefully not something like everybody is food secure and livelihood secure and physically secure, but just something very concrete that you could imagine happening in the next sort of 5 years. That would be a really clear marker of, okay, this is working. These conversations are happening. There's the funding. There's action, and realizing something.
Yeah, I think, there's been some really good work done in the Pacific to start to understand how climate change impacts on, our states, at least at a national level. But I think there's some way for us to go to further assist some of our member states and communities to really understand and contextualize what those climate security risks are, and then design kind of adequate solutions. I think in terms of what's like a medium-term, like best case scenario, we've got a lot of low-lying atoll states that we've got some really good examples. Tuvalu, for example, TCAP, Tuvalu has been very proactive in advocating for their plight, and what the result is that you've got, they're doing amazing land reclamation on Funafuti. So, they're raising the height, I guess, of Funafuti, and they're going to rebuild the entire of the capital city, right? Which is amazing, and it's first time this has been done, and that was because Tuvalu was proactive. Some other states who maybe haven't been as proactive, the future doesn't look as good. So in the Pacific, we really have an opportunity to be proactive. I think one of the things that we are being really proactive about is the mobility, and at a regional level, the forums come together, and we've got a framework on climate mobility and an action plan associated with this. Basically to provide communities with the information they need to know, the peer-to-peer exchange, provide them with a macro risk assessment to be able to I guess, identify communities that may need to be moved, and then make sure there's a really long period of planning that goes into that before the mobility takes place. So I think, that's the big thing I think the perfect world would be we enable proactive responses to the climate impacts that are happening in the Pacific. And another one, you're getting warming oceans, and this is a really big one. Some of our states rely 100% of their government revenues on tuna, right? The Pacific has 60% of the world's tuna, and it's the only healthy stock remaining. What we know is that warming oceans are going to move those tuna into international waters, and what that means for those low-lying states is existential. Not only are they dealing with sea level rise, but also they got this movement of tuna. So there are some challenges which we know are going to happen, and that luckily we have some time in order to be able to actually prepare and try to mitigate some of those implications.
Okay, I can answer that from my perspective, which is totally different. But I really like what you said, and I really appreciate what you're saying about mitigation, adaptation, different ways to do things. But mitigation is mitigation, and adaptation is adaptation. It does work, but we need a more, I think, violent, not drastic shift in the way we view the world, the way we operate macroeconomically. I mean, because if we don't, we're going to hit the wall. And some are going to hit the wall sooner than others, even if they adapt, even if they try to mitigate. So I hope, on my point of view, is that I hope that these decisions that I was talking to you about will kind of accelerate this change and operate changes in paradigm, and that the states will use them. Some small island states have said, wow, this is opening a door. This is opening a Pandora box. We're going to use this. And I hope that these litigation cases will appear all over the world to put some pressure on climate diplomacy, because something needs to be done. We just can't continue like we are continuing. I mean, And also, the rights of nature is something interesting because legally, and we have an eminent professor here, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but you could have 10 lawyers across in a room and they would have 10 different opinions, but please kindly correct me. But the rights of nature, it's so interesting because when you litigate, you need to show an interest, that you have an interest in the litigation. But if nature have their own rights, I mean, nature has its own interest, so you don't need to show your own interest as a human being. You can represent nature. So I can be in Canada raising funding to represent the coral reef in Tuvalu. So this is what makes it so interesting. It opens the door for nature to have their own lawyers between the court. And maybe it's not tomorrow that we'll have these decisions, but it will start to happen little by little. We're not saying in the ground yet, but it's going to happen little by little. And it does put a lot of pressure on the negotiations and, yeah.
Not to comment on that because I fully agree, but just to highlight another aspect of the topic. We're talking here about rethinking vulnerability resilience in island nations, but without the resilience of island nations, communities will have a hard time. So that's the whole discussion about sea level rise threatening statehood. And I think there are some really, really interesting developments going on. I was part of a committee on sea level rise and international law of the International Law Association, ILA, which then led to work by the ILC, which is the International Law Commission of the UN, and then debates in the 6th Committee of the UN General Assembly. And what we developed was legal argumentation. Why, even when the sea level is rising, the so-called baselines and the outer limits of the sea territory are not moving. Because according to the Convention on the Law of Sea, if it's flooded, then all of that retreats. And then in the end, nothing is left. And the interesting thing is that in the 6th Committee, a majority of states already have agreed with this position. If you have submitted these charts to the Secretary General in accordance with the Convention on the Law of the Sea, then these lines remain fixed with regard to climate-related sea level rise. But it's not only that, we also developed some legal argumentation why even if a state loses its territory, statehood will continue. I don't want to go into the legal details. And again, it was immediately taken up. There we are not yet at the majority of states agreeing with that, but some are, like Australia, like New Zealand. Now, and this really opens up new perspectives and changes the discussion. But my question to Jamie is, all of that came to reality because PIF leaders immediately took it up and made those bold statements. And then other island nations kind of followed. What are the reasons why the Pacific is so much in the forefront? Because if you look at the Indian Ocean, if you look at the Caribbean island nations, of course they take the same positions, but they are not proactive. So there must be something of a special force in the Pacific why it's happening. You might say, yeah, you're not fighting with each other. Yes, but politically, there are divides among Polynesia, Micronesia, Micronesia, and still, even though the different governments have different positions on these issues, very forceful voice.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. There must be something in the water. Yeah, I think, and you're right in pointing out, like, the Pacific's often seen as, similar people, but in reality, Luke's just been in PNG very different. And even in Melanesia, there's so much difference in Melanesia, so much difference in Polynesia. So there's all of these differences. And I think, there's a thing called Pacific regionalism. And it's a commitment by Pacific Island leaders that, and it's been a long time in the making. And, there have been fractures in Pacific regionalism, and there have been times when the Pacific has come together. But I think what they've learned over that time is that the region is a lot stronger together. And so I guess it's on the back of a lot of hard work that's been done by governments across the region for the last, 30, 40 years, and working through that those hard challenges together. And then I guess with the end goal in mind of putting the values of the Pacific, which I think the values of the Pacific are what are similar. Like they're all it's looking for things that are similar. So all ocean people, all kind of in similar circumstances. A lot of indigenous communities. So there's indigenous values, although they're different. There's a lot of kind of similarities in there. So I think, in part, it has been because of that regionalism, and the part of the topic of this whole this conference is geopolitics. And the Pacific is really the center of geopolitics now, and you're seeing that the impact that's having on regionalism. So these Pacific Island countries and the way that they're working together, you're seeing how those different interest groups are actually challenging that regionalism. And it was really interesting. You might have seen recently at the Pacific Islands Forum leaders meeting, where all leaders come together for the year and discuss. There was some debates around. Well, this is one of the only leaders meetings there was no dialogue partners, but I think in reflection, this gave those Pacific Island leaders an opportunity in turbulent times to spend an entire week together and to really have some proper conversation and work some of the more tricky issues out. So it's not to say that there's the seas are smooth ahead, but we've seen these things like the Declaration on Statehood and the power that it can have if those countries come together, at least in that regional sphere, and then what the impact is on multilateralism. And I think it's quite interesting to think of, we're talking a lot about the struggles of multilateralism. In a way, the Pacific Islands, how that regionalism is like mini multilateralism. So, even though the Pacific, we see that there's a challenges to multilateral, it's really, the Pacific leaders are really doubling down on that regional approach, because we know that's our best hope, right? As bargaining as a bloc is a lot more effective than going it alone as small island developing states. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, please.
Thank you. I think speaking of the challenges to regionalism, I think Jamie has raised some really interesting points, and I would like to bring up the topic of deep sea mining, because I've been following developments at the international level, especially within the International Seabed Authority, and we are seeing diverse views from island nations. And for example, Nauru was the country who triggered the 2-year rule at the international level to make sure that there are mining regulations in place when it comes to deep sea mining. The global drive for deep sea mining has not started yet, so it's just in the exploration phase. But we are seeing different, really diverse views from island nations, and this question really sits at the forefront of climate, green energy transition, and also preservation, because we are seeing island nations taking the stance of accelerating the green energy transition, because deep sea mining would unlock a lot of potential resources in deep sea for the green energy transition, copper, nickel, and so on. But it also would create immense risk for the coastal community, especially when it comes to livelihoods. You mentioned the tuna, and also there's this one recent piece of research which shows that the warming waters are driving tunas towards international waters, and these areas are potentially overlapping with the mining grounds that some countries are now currently exploring. So this is, I think this is more a remark, how this can be a challenge to how island nations come together for climate resilience work, and also how this may present a potential challenge to regionalism.
I think, Jamie, if you can answer that question, you get the Nobel Peace Prize, because that was, yeah, so good luck.
No, I think it's important just to note that, in my capacity, I have the privilege of sitting within the Pacific Islands Forum and not necessarily speaking on behalf, but I think I'll just go back to what I was saying before in terms of that regionalism. There are divergent views within the region, and I think the strength of having that regional system there and the concept of, call it talanoa, right? It's a sort of an informal way to sit together and to debate these issues. The forum will provide that platform for that dialogue and talanoa to go forward. And we've just come out with a declaration called the Ocean of Peace, which has a number of principles in it around how the Pacific sees itself in the world and how we see peace within that. So I think there is some, it's going to be an issue which is going to continue to be raised in the Pacific, but we have those mechanisms in there to at least enable that frank and honest conversation around the benefits and the trade-offs to the deep sea mining. Yeah.
Are there other questions from folks in the room? Yeah, please. And then Lucas, I'll come to you.
Thank you. I'd like to come back a little bit to the International Court of Justice advisory opinion and its impact on climate diplomacy, especially in terms of the COP negotiation and the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement. I'd like to really know your insight about how it will change dynamics. I also wrote my own piece on the ICJ opinion, especially looking at Vanuatu's statement in front of the ICJ, and found it very interesting that on the one hand, Vanuatu is building upon what the COP has enriched understanding with adaptation, loss, and damage, and elaborated the statement. But on the other hand, Vanuatu also challenges the concept, how loss and damage frames under the negotiation, and then can try to contest it. And now I think the negotiation ground is a little bit shifting after the ICJ opinion. So I'd like to know your insight to what will happen after the ICJ's advisory opinion, and what kind of change with dynamics of a climate negotiation you predict, and especially for Jamie, for the Pacific Island country, do you think that the ICJ opinion would kind of have an influence on the Pacific's approach to this multilateral process, and what would be the next step from the ICJ opinion? Thanks.
That's not an easy question either, so I can give you my insight. A few years ago, when we were talking about climate justice, it was such a difficult. I've been to one COP, by the way, so I'm no expert in COPs, okay? So, but the one I went to, when we were talking about climate justice, it was kind of sensitive issue because it's not climate justice; it's ethical. It's not legal responsibility, it's moral and ethical. States don't have to do anything. They can agree in a convention that they're going to help the most vulnerable nations, but they don't have to do it. They do it because of their good faith. They do it because voluntarily, because it's a moral issue, but it's not anymore, is it? So now it's become illegal, unless you don't recognize the advisory decision, which I'm sure some states will not recognize. We know who we're talking about here. But if you do, then, it's not a moral issue anymore. It has never been, but it wasn't accepted. Now it's undeniable. You can't say that it's not a legal opinion and that it's not a legal issue. Even Canada, Canada wasn't saying it's a matter of climate justice, maybe a bit, but it's more something we're doing like voluntarily. So even Canada I know will recognize, because I'm Canadian, the International Court of Justice advisory opinion, that's for sure. So it's going to shift the way that they see conventions on climate change, that's for sure. And the loss and damage, that is so interesting because, yet again, loss and damage is really some kind of legal responsibility type of wording, but it wasn't viewed as a legal instrument or a legal response, because still it was there to compensate voluntarily, out of capacity building and, moral values, what the states, small island states were experiencing. But it's not that anymore. It's now a legal instrument of compensation derived from a legal opinion of an International Court of Justice, asked by the General Assembly, by the way. So, it has a lot of credibility. And it's I think it's a good instrument because it's difficult. When you want to make a legal responsibility case, you have to I'm been trained in civil and French, so I'm going to try and translate it, and please, professor, correct me, but you have this causal link that you have to prove. It's not so easy with climate change impacts, because who's really responsible for Tuvalu? I mean, you, me, a lot of people, and a lot of states. It's not so easy to demonstrate who's really responsible and to what percentage. But the court has said in its decision somewhere, it's not easy, but it's not impossible. With the technology that we have now, it becomes possible to know what type of greenhouse gas emissions end up where and doing what damage. But it's still a difficult case and complicated case to make before a court of justice. And that's where the loss and damage fund becomes interesting, because by financing, by making, sending money, giving funds to the loss and damage, you're kind of admitting that, the compensation is needed, and it can serve as some lump sum for compensation. So in my opinion, it changes a lot of things, really, but we might not see it at this COP30. It might take a few years before we really realize the groundbreaking 2025 years on an environmental perspective.
Emma, do you want to clarify something really quickly before I hand it over to
quick follow-up
Jamie?
question.
Yeah.
And this is super interesting, because Adelphi is actually working on right now a sort of policy brief trying to link the ICJ decision to climate security. I guess my question is just, do you think, you said it will take some time, do you think it will happen fast enough for, like, in terms of the amount of action and investment that needs to happen? Do you think the legal sort of frameworks, though they're foundational and really will shift, as you said, the view of many states in terms of their climate commitments, do you think it will happen fast enough? And if not, what can we do to encourage that process to happen a little bit faster?
Again, a very tricky question. Maybe you have a better answer than I do. It should have happened 10 years ago. So in 1929, there was this litigation between Canada and United States for a foundry, which was polluting from. Canada was polluting the U.S. or the other way around, I don't remember, but still. And the court rendered the decision that whoever was polluting, because I don't really remember, was responsible. It was this company. So either the state is responsible for not regulating the company with its emissions, or the company is itself responsible. We're in 1929. That's a long time ago. But when I was speaking about this to some colleagues at the UN, they were saying, no, I mean, what are you saying? It's not legal, it's ethical. So, and we were like many years after. I hope, so I have no answer for you, but I hope that it will happen very fast. But you, me, everyone has something to do. We need to change. I mean, there are some players in these discussions that are notably absent from the table, who are the multinational corporations, because they have a lot to do with greenhouse gas emissions and a lot to say and a lot to account for. And this is, I think, something that I really hope we will see legally in the next year, because these multilateral corporations, they have GDP that exceeds that of many countries, and they're structured to generate profit. A corporation is structured legally to generate profit. That's how it operates. And they don't have they're not accountable in many ways, and they should. So I hope that this type of decisions, particularly the one regarding responsible nature also, will shift a bit the responsibility to the corporations that are actually responsible for all the problems that we're experimenting. Professor needs to complete my...
Well, and I don't want to forget the second half of your question that we have open for Jamie, so don't think we forgot you, Jamie. So you're scripting the best answer. All right, Professor, over to you.
Again, I fully agree with you, but just to come back to what you said on causality. What is really important in the advisory opinion, and which is not new law, I mean, that's what professors teach their students, is causality is an issue that only arises when we're talking about damage that needs to be compensated. So they make a distinction between the question of violation of international law, and if you violate international law, and that's, for instance, if you're not implementing policies that are likely to help to achieve the 1.5 centigrade goal, then you're violating the law. And this leads to reparation. But there are different kinds of reparation, like, for instance, you are then required to adopt those laws to better control private companies, and it's not a question of damage. Only when you're asking for compensation for damage, causality comes in. So that's already a very, very important distinction, which means that lots of things can be done in terms of, holding emitters accountable for inaction or insufficient action. And I mean, that's the first and foremost thing. We need to reduce emissions. That's the core of it. And that's what some of the Pacific Island states always feared in the negotiations, that in the end they say, well, we go up and then we resettle a few hundred people and we pay for that and the problem is solved. First and foremost, reduction, mitigation. Okay.
No, you are absolutely right. And this answers the question of the colleague also with regards to COP. That's yet another entry point for, climate negotiations.
I think the question was how would this change how Pacific Island countries approach things. I think a real important thing to remember about the ICJ is that, and this gives us hope, it was actually students who took that advisory opinion, and so I think that gives us a little bit of hope around this younger generation and the way that they're approaching this challenge and supporting our Pacific Island countries to do it. So, in terms of how will it change, I'm very new to COP and the associated processes. I don't necessarily have a view on that. I think should the Pacific get COP31, I think there's a number of really good opportunities, around ICJ, but I also think around climate security, and how that sits in COP31, and some definitely some further thinking on that we can do as a community in terms of how do we elevate that, and how does that benefit the Pacific and other small island developing states, as well as those the more fragile contexts as well.
Yeah, thank you. And if the UNFCCC is listening, we hope that you make a decision on COP soon. So no pressure, but a lot of pressure. Okay, other questions, Lucas? I think you had a hand raised. Did you want to come in on any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's super interesting discussion, and we're kind of straddling a lot of different issues from kind of deep sea mining to geopolitics to legal innovation. I wanted to bring it back a bit to the resilience, vulnerability question and cultural and traditional practices. I've been thinking a lot about kind of what it means to operationalize climate security in the Pacific, specifically kind of linking climate change adaptation, conflict and violence prevention, peace building. Well, we have a lot of experiences, but they come from other contexts and they're not that applicable for the kinds of violence and conflict we see and security issues we see in the Pacific, and also against this specific cultural context. So I don't think we can just take, for example, what's been done in Africa and start from that. And I'm just kind of from my reflection from Papua New Guinea, but also the analysis we did on Tuvalu, Kiribati, and RMI. I think there is a lot of these specificities that are super interesting to build on, the resilience factors that are in place with the cultural practices, and how you can see that under increasing pressure, they're also turning into vulnerabilities. In PNG, for example, when the disaster hits, people move to kind of host communities where they have familiar or clan ties, and that has been working very well, but it's working less and less well, and there's a lot of violence and abuse that these displaced population groups face in the communities, and it's leading to new conflicts there. So it feels like these cultural practices are reaching their limit a little bit and turning actually into vulnerabilities. The same with kind of land rights, right? Traditional land rights, such an important resilience factor. It's so important for local communities to have a say in development. But then if there's more pressure and more encroachment and developmental pressures, then because there's so many claims on this land, then it can easily turn into violence. And then if the traditional mechanisms don't work anymore to manage that can turn into violence. And in PNG, it's maybe the most obvious where it really turns into violent conflict and death and on a communal level. But also, I feel, as you said, there's like in the other islands, there's much less violence, except gender-based violence, which is kind of like an outlier. But still, if you see what's happening in kind of especially the urban context, is that these traditional mechanisms and social cohesion are really fraying, and there's crime increasing, there's gender-based violence increasing, there's other kinds of violence increasing, and people are ringing the alarm bell, but because it's not this violent conflict that we see somewhere else, there's not enough happening to kind of prevent this. And we were talking about being proactive and how Tuvalu is proactive at like rebuilding the capital, of reclaiming land. And my feeling is like that there are these approaches and proactive approaches, especially on the technical level, but they're not necessarily embedded in similar action to kind of like, what does it mean to keep social cohesion in urban areas? What does it mean to keep traditions alive when people move from rural areas into, and family ties are fraying apart? And I'm wondering if that would be something for actually operationalizing climate security, to go into that gap and see what is possible beyond kind of technical applications. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Lucas. And just, Jamie, before I hand it back over to you, we have 5 minutes left of our session. I can't believe it. This was like the fastest, 45 minutes or however long we had for the session. An hour? Do we have an hour? Wow. So while you answer Lucas's question, if you could offer any final comments in summary, and then Paulo, I'll turn over to you, and then we'll close out. So.
Yeah, I think, all you said is so correct. Like, we really don't have the research, we really don't understand enough how climate change is interacting with all those other factors and where those kind of intervention points are. I think, you talk like it is those traditional structures, they are under pressure, and we're seeing them kind of be challenged. And I think, and there's not really that much work at the moment that's actually looking at how do we then strengthen those. How do we support communities to what do they need in order to be able to strengthen those structures? And like, I think I mentioned maybe we talked about this, but like we're seeing that rural to urban migration, and in those squatter settlements in a lot of the cities, we are seeing a lot of sort of localized conflicts and stuff, and people are moving into those cities because of climate change. And then there's conflicts that are around like kind of clan disputes or sorcery, for example. So there's a number of kind of interlapping features. And often what happens in those urban contexts is the traditional structures are taken away altogether. And so it's not that those people haven't got those values when they move to those cities, just that they haven't got they're not in environments where they've kind of like those informal structures are formalized, if you know what I mean. So I think there's some value in looking at, those are the settings where we're seeing high levels of domestic violence as well, and obviously climate change is shifting people into those cities. And how do we empower those traditional mechanisms? Because we know that like traditional security services or the government can't help in those circumstances. But I think and there's things called travelling traditions. So those people have come from those environments where there are these justice mechanisms. How do we enable them to bring those traditions into those informal settlement settings to help bring some of that cultural, those cultural practices which help with social cohesion? But like, I think the bottom line is we really need more research, and like the work you guys have been doing in PNG will be really, it's going to really, really help our work. So I think as a takeaway, we really need more research on the Pacific and how culture impacts. I mean, the plan for the forum, hopefully going forward, is to support further risk assessment in some of our countries, because that can really, start to help us contextualize some of that risk, and then also identify communities and help them better articulate their needs, and then apply to the Pacific Resilience Facility, which will come online next year and will be accessible for them.
Well, I'm so excited for the PRF to come online. We have a lot of fans in the audience, so thank you for your great work. Do you want to offer any final comments? And we have, I think, a couple of minutes left, but
Yeah,
welcome.
maybe 1 minute. With regards to climate finance, which is a subject that interests me a lot, you said, Jamie, earlier, top-down. Well, that's one of the main problems. I mean, perhaps we could start by having a human rights-based approach, which means making the project documents available in the language of the local populations. That's, I think, a first. Transparency. Where does the money actually go? Where does it end up? Does it end up really to the local population or through some international NGO who's affiliated with whoever fund or whoever country? Transparency, accountability, conflict analysis, do no harm principle. You don't want to get in there and aggravate. And Jamie, you've spoken so well about this. Aggravate what is already, very fragile. And complaint mechanisms. If someone feels, in the language of the local population, a complaint mechanism, so the person can actually, have someone to talk to if the funds are not being used correctly, or if there is some nepotism or whatever, corruption. And that's basically human rights-based approach, I think, to climate finance is really the answer there.
Great, thank you. I'm leaving the session feeling a lot lighter. I actually, shockingly, I thought we were going to hear some really sad stories, and because there are so many sad stories out there, but actually, in the interest of time, I was going to go through a quick summary, but perhaps my main takeaway is what Paula said in terms of, because it may not be easy, that does not mean it's impossible. And so we should take that as a challenge. And I ask you all to challenge yourselves in terms of, applying some of the lessons and key takeaways that you've heard in here today. And really, I think, hold ourselves accountable, right? And this was a comment that Jamie made earlier in terms of how do we facilitate that hope in the younger generation? Because obviously we're all here, we have the privilege of being here to try and establish those dialogues and relationships, but I think taking that to the next level and connecting with the younger generation is going to be key. So thank you all for your time. I've really enjoyed our conversations, and I think we have 20 minutes now. 20-minute break, so you are continue the conversations. Hopefully I'm not putting you guys on the spot. And then we'll see you back in the main plenary session at 4:50. Yep, okay, great. Thank you.